All right. Wow, look at this crowd on such a snowy night. Really appreciate seeing you. We were happy that the airplane today came in on time from Dulles to Grand Rapids, and I was pleased to see that Senator Snowe came in on an airplane with a right wing and a left wing. She's great, just great, just great. You know, events like this don't happen without the partnerships and the sponsors, the supporters of many people, and I just want to take a moment to say thank you to all the people in this room who have been so supportive of our Common Ground initiative. We so appreciate our partnership with the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. Joe Calvaruso, please show yourself there. Great partners with the Ford, and there's so many other individuals in this room. I mean, I can barely keep track of all of the folks who have stepped up to be supportive of Common Ground. Don Lubbers, and we have Annette Kirk in the crowd. We have Ann Hiskus. We have Noreen Myers. We have Fred Anzac. We have President Haas. We have Karen Loth, Hillary Snell. So many people who share our vision that it's important, vitally important now to pursue a Common Ground agenda for principled negotiation and actionable common ground for the common good. And there's one person in this room that I would really like to single out. You may have seen a headline in the newspaper on Sunday, and we are very proud that we are able to be a part of this man's life. Ralph Hauenstein has been our #1 patron. Give him a hand. Ralph, your generosity has made all the difference at the Hauenstein Center. Thank you so much for your commitment to raising a new generation of leaders who understand the principles of Common Ground. And we're just delighted that we're able to host programs such as tonight because of your generosity and the generosity of all of our sponsors and donors. Thank you so much. Well, at this point, it gives me great pleasure and an honor to introduce the introducer of Olympia Snowe. I'd like to bring forward Hank Meijer, who, as you know, is the co-chairman, director, and CEO of Meijer and the super centers out there in many of the states here in the Midwest. I want to just say, you might have also been reading in the newspaper this week, the same section of the paper I just held up, that Hank just received an honorary doctorate from GVSU from Thomas Haas. So, and the last thing I want to say about our friend Hank, because he's been so supportive of the Hauenstein Center and Grand Valley State University, is he himself is quite a Senate historian in his own right, and his work inspired the Mike Grass documentary on the senator that we can be so proud of here in West Michigan, Arthur Vandenberg. This is available for purchase. Just sign up out at the table outside of our room here. Hank Meijer, please join us. Welcome, Hank Meijer.
Thank you, Gleaves, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be brief as well, but sometimes we welcome a distinguished visitor to Grand Rapids in the winter months with a little trepidation and feeling defensive about our weather. Tonight, perhaps we can say that we wanted to make her feel right at home. Nearly 20 years ago, Olympia Snowe became only the second woman to represent her native state of Maine in the United States Senate. She followed the pioneering lead of Margaret Chase Smith. Her path was paved with challenges. She first became a state legislator by succeeding her husband, who was killed in an automobile crash. And then at the age of 31, she became the youngest Republican woman ever elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where she served for 16 years before moving to the Senate. Throughout her career, through 3 Senate terms, she stood out as a leader committed, as our hometown Senator Arthur Vandenberg would have said, to hunting for the middle ground. That was one of his favorite expressions, and when you come to think of it, it's pretty close to the title of the program tonight. For Senator Snowe quickly established a reputation as a Republican who reached across the aisle for bipartisan solutions. We welcome Senator Snowe to a part of the country where we hope she'll feel at home, not only because winter has already arrived with full force, but because for most of the past half century, Grand Rapids was recognized as a place that voted Republican, usually, and reached across the aisle. That was what Gerald Ford schooled us to expect during all his years in Congress. And it was what made Arthur Vandenberg famous in the Senate, and what made Senator Snow's female predecessor, Margaret Chase Smith, an eager ally of Senator Vandenberg when she went to Washington in 1949. So Maine and Michigan share some important ties as we welcome tonight the distinguished former senator from Maine, Olympia Snowe. Senator Snowe.
Thank you all. Thank you very much, Hank, for that wonderful and kind introduction. And I'm just truly delighted to be here this evening. I do thank you for the warm welcome. Well, maybe not. But it does make me feel right at home. You don't have to explain anything to me. I understand it completely. But in exchange, I promise you I'm going to follow the advice of a very wise man. When he told me, so Olympia, a great speech is one with a good beginning and a good ending, which are kept very close together. So I'm going to try to do that. A good beginning would be to say what a pleasure it is to be here this evening at the Grand Valley State University. I'm delighted to see President Hausen, meet him, and this exemplary institution and phenomenal leadership. And, of course, at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. And first, I want to express my appreciation to Hank, not just for the great introduction, but most especially for his extraordinary support of the Hauenstein Center. It's an example of exemplary corporate leadership, and it represents, in my opinion, the fundamental tenet of the saying that service to others is the rent we pay for our being here on earth. And so I want to thank you, Hank, for all that you do and continue to do for Grand Rapids, Michigan, and for the country. So thank you. I'm delighted to know that he's an expert in Senator Vandenberg because, you know, I served on the Foreign Affairs Committee for 14 out of my 16 years in the House of Representatives and 2 years on Foreign Relations in the United States Senate. And Senator Vandenberg was an iconic example of excellence. And his name was invoked constantly because he had the famous declaration that when it comes to foreign policy, politics stops at the water's edge, because he collaborated with President Truman and forging bipartisan support for the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and NATO. So it's no wonder that his portrait hangs in a place of honor in the Senate reception room, which is right off the Senate chamber. Perhaps it should hang from the ceiling of the Senate chamber itself as a reminder of how they're supposed to work together. But that's, that is a place of significant recognition, and obviously demonstrated the contributions that he made to this country. I also want to convey my gratitude to Gleaves Whitney for all that he is doing with the Hauenstein Center, with his phenomenal leadership and the depth and breadth of his experience that he brings to this position, and placing the center of changing the direction of our country and our government by nurturing the next generation of leadership for this country. And you are very fortunate to have someone like Cleaves at the helm of the organization that's promoting civic engagement. Of course, this wouldn't have been possible without Colonel Ralph Hauenstein. And it's a singular honor and a privilege for me this evening to meet you and for all that you have done for our country. The incalculable contributions that you have made throughout a lifetime. We won't say how many years. But let's just say he ought to be sharing his formula for success with the rest of us, don't you think? He's done a remarkable job. But in launching, having the visionary leadership to launch this center for the sole purpose of generating the next, leadership with the spirit of being able to solve problems and devoted to public service. And I think that that is going to be critically important going forward, given the current climate in Washington today. So we thank you, Colonel Hauenstein, for all that you have done and for the contributions that you've made to our country in a lifetime of service. And your legacy will resonate for generations because you will have made your mark on the future generation of lawmakers. And besides, he was named a cool cat by rock star Bono. now you know you've made it. I couldn't help, obviously, but notice, all that is being done here and the commitment that you're all making here through the Hauenstein Center and also the community of Grand Rapids through this Common Ground initiative, which I certainly want to applaud and commend you, because it's this type of initiative that is going to be integral to the health of our community, our country, and democracy now more than ever. And it's certainly timely because of the current climate in Washington and how we have to reverse the tide of the hyper-partisanship that, frankly, is putting the future prosperity of this country in jeopardy. And I was really struck by the similarities in our titles. So don't sue me for copyright infringement, will you? But I think we're on the same page. But I was truly impressed by the description of the Center's program on Common Ground. It said the Common Ground Initiative brings together progressives and conservatives in an open, respectful, intellectually rigorous forum to confront the challenges Americans face. Now, clearly, you can initiate Congress in that approach. They ought to be borrowing a page out of your book on how to solve problems and bring the country together. And speaking of which, when we talk about Washington and how it functions, it certainly brings to mind an American leader who embodied the very essence of leadership and pragmatism and a principled approach to governance. And that is, of course, someone who grew up here in Grand Rapids and represented Grand Rapids in the U.S. House of Representatives and became the 38th President of the United States, President Gerald Ford. He will be forever remembered as a man of unassailable integrity and decency. He devoted his life not only to the finest ideals of public service, but also to the nation he loved. He represented a voice of civility, a consensus building, a problem solving, and healing. And there's no question that history will record his contributions to America as not only indispensable, but irrefutable. I couldn't help but recall the resonance of his pragmatism and bipartisan approach to governing, which is certainly in stark contrast to the hyperpartisanship that exists today in Washington. As the President stated at the rededication of his library, and keep in mind this was 16 years ago, and I quote, "Many find it impossible to listen to each other because they're busy shouting at each other. In some quarters, civility is mistaken for weakness and compromise for surrender. Politics is a clash of ideas, not a blood sport. It's a contest of principles, not a holy war. So instead of blaming the people for their mistrust of government, maybe politicians in both parties should ask themselves why the public is so turned off to politics." Now, I probably could just end my speech right there, frankly, but you're not going to get off that lucky. But it's certainly to the point. I can only imagine what President Ford would be thinking today. But in all seriousness, that's precisely what I would like to address tonight. What's happening in Washington or what's not happening in Washington, why it's gone off track, what has contributed to undermining the political system, and why, in spite of all of that, do I believe that we can make government work again. As Hank mentioned, I served, I hope you didn't do the math, but I've served 40 years in the legislative branch of government, and 34 of which were in the House of Representatives in the United States Senate. And as you can imagine, over those decades, I had many good experiences and some not so good. And it always reminds me of the story that was told to me by Senator Charles Mack Mathias of Maryland. He was a moderate Republican, and he happened to own a house in Maine on an island that required him to take the ferry from the mainland to the island. So one day, Senator Mathias was on the ferry, and the ferry operator recognized him. And they began a conversation, and during the course of their discussion, the ferry operator says to Senator Mathias, he said, "There must be a lot of smart people down in Washington, aren't there?" And Senator Mathias said, "Well, yes, there are a lot of smart people." And then the ferry operator said, "Well, I bet that there are a lot of people who aren't so smart too, right?" Then Senator Mathias says, "Yeah, yes, I'd have to agree with you on that as well." To which the ferry operator quickly replied, "And it's getting harder and harder to tell the difference." Well, it might have been funnier back in the 1970s, but today it's just a little bit closer to reality. Although you're very fortunate to have two senators, Senator Levin and Senator Stabenow, who represent you exceptionally well in the United States Senate. But as they would agree, they have witnessed over time many examples of Congress's potential, but fewer and fewer over the last few years. I experienced, firsthand what can be accomplished when people of various political backgrounds and differences could come together and solve problems, even and especially during perilous times. But now, unfortunately, it has all dramatically changed. And I don't normally enjoy being right under these circumstances because the perilous inaction and dynamic that's occurring in Congress has grown ever worse. And that is deeply troubling, and that's what contributed to my decision not to seek re-election to the United States Senate. I came to the cold, stark realization that the excessive partisanship would not be diminished in the short term. And I decided to take my fight outside the institution and work for change in a different direction. As we have seen over the last few years, we have lurched from one self-engineered crisis to another. That really essentially began with the debt ceiling in 2011 that triggered the first ever downgrade of our AAA credit rating. It created the highest level of policy uncertainty based on a study conducted by 3 economists. And ultimately, it will cost the taxpayers more than $20 billion, according to the Bipartisan Policy Center, as a result of the higher interest rates during that period of time. When you think about the fact that it created the greatest uncertainty of any event over the last 20 to 25 years, that includes 3 wars, includes impeachment, includes the financial crisis, the collapse of the Lehman Brothers, and the catastrophic events of September 11th. And then the last Congress was bookended by the fiscal cliff, which was the expiration of the Bush tax cuts as well as the automatic cuts that were part of the agreement to avert a breach in the debt ceiling in 2011. That culminated in a vote at 2 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Day, which ended up being my final vote in the United States Senate, but illustrative of the process had gone seriously awry that it culminated in a vote on New Year's Day at 2 o'clock in the morning. It is no way to govern a great nation when you operate by delay, default, and deferral. It certainly underscored the fact that we were shortchanging America to address our monumental problems facing this country, and that we were not only lurching from crisis to crisis, but ultimately abrogating our responsibilities and abrogating the whole legislative process, and it had devolved into a series of gotcha votes to advantage one side to the detriment of the other. Everything's designed for the next election, for the 30-second soundbite. Every position, every vote that's cast, and everything that is framed on the floor of the United States Senate were designed for the next election. And nowhere was there a greater indication of the breakdown in the entire legislative process than, of course, when it comes to the budget. America is the largest economy in the world and operates without a budget. Up until yesterday, when they reached an agreement, and finally, for the 3 consecutive years, Congress has not passed a budget, failed to pass it on time this year. Now, Congress began with much fanfare at the beginning of this new Congress by saying no budget, no pay, meaning that if they passed their budget in their respective chambers, they would be fine. If they didn't, they would lose their pay. But they didn't address the question of whether or not that bill, the budget, became law, which is required by law on April 15th. And obviously, that didn't happen this year. And of course, beyond failing to adopt a budget, Congress also failed to pass any one of the 12 appropriation bills that are necessary to fund the operations of government. The Senate passed 0 out of the 12 this year, and those are required to be passed before the beginning of the fiscal year on October 1st, 0 last year, and the House of Representatives passed 4 out of the 12 this year. Now, if any one of those appropriation bills had passed, then the corresponding agency would have been up and running, even in spite of the shutdown. Now, if Congress had done its job and passed all 12 appropriations, then the group in the House of Representatives would not have had the leverage to shut down the government. If Congress had only fulfilled its basic responsibilities in passing the 12 appropriations, we wouldn't have faced the 16 days of a shutdown. If they had passed a budget, we would have been in a far different position as a country in establishing our priorities year after year. Now, the Democrats and Republicans have become like 2 ships passing in the night. One's in the Atlantic and one is in the Pacific. And so they passed not only wildly divergent budgets, and obviously they're light years away philosophically on keystone issues such as debt, entitlement, and taxes, and the Affordable Care Act, immersed in a harsh political environment. In normal legislative conditions, those differences wouldn't be insurmountable. But in the kind of environment that exists today, it makes it almost virtually impossible. It sort of reminds me, when I think about the construct of every crisis in Congress over the last few years, that would be like the captain of the Titanic manufacturing icebergs to hit, because that's essentially the bottom line of what's happening in Congress, is that they create what I call the high noon at the OK Corral moment. It's scorched earth politics approach. It's winning at all costs. It's the all or nothing proposition. It doesn't do anything for the country. It doesn't advance the interests of the country, but it advances a political agenda. So as a result of the shutdown and playing a game of chicken with a debt ceiling, we were held captive for that period of time to raw ideological interests, minority causes, podium-thumping belligerents, all designed to appeal to the political base, but not designed to raise the institutions to forge the collective solutions to the problems this country is facing. And so as a result, you get the abrogation of leadership that puts us at a tipping point of where we are today. Now, as you know, as part of the agreement to reopen government, they extended the funding of government till January 15th of next year and the debt ceiling till February 7th, and also required that the House and Senate budget committees confer on those differences, which should have been done months ago. And that conference committee convened, and as you know, Chairman Ryan, Chairman Murray, reached an accord that was announced yesterday. And it is important that they did, be it it's a small baby step It is a process that at least, I think, demonstrates that they have the ability to forge some consensus when they're willing to talk to one another. In the overall context of the debt problem, obviously it's a pebble in the ocean, but nevertheless it is important that they were able to move forward in a way that suggests that still that bipartisanship is achievable. Now, dysfunction today in the Congress essentially has contributed to the definition of success as achieving the lowest common denominator, regrettably. But nevertheless, I think it is important to view it as a confidence-building measure in moving forward in the days and weeks ahead. Because in the final analysis, they weren't able to address those keystone issues that I was talking about earlier because the issues are so widely disparate in terms of the positions that each side embraces. And so as a result, it's virtually impossible to reconcile those differences under the current scenario. As one reporter characterized it early on about the philosophical differences in the two budgets, one passed in the Republican House and one in the Democratic Senate. He compared it, he said, not like apples and oranges, but more like a version of apples and bicycles. And so that probably sums it up. But ultimately, in the final analysis, we cannot afford to institutionalize this culture of the all or nothing polarization or allow it to become the new norm. We have to do everything that we can to reverse this tide of ideological absolutism, and that somehow compromise is akin to capitulation. If you don't move legislation forward, you can't move the country. And that's why ultimately we are facing the considerable problems still economically. I know you've experienced that here in Michigan. You've been hard hit, as so many parts of the country. And that's why, because of that legislative negligence over the last few years and deferring all of these keystone issues of entitlements and debt reduction and tax reform and regulatory reform, has resulted in the worst post-recession recovery in the history of our country. I mean, we still have the lowest number of employed Americans because of the price of uncertainty. The price of uncertainty due to Congress's inability to address those key issues has contributed, according to macroeconomics, a loss of 900,000 jobs. And according to Chairman Bernanke, he said that the polarizing debate and the uncertainty has ultimately put the country in a position of experiencing more of the 8 or 9% unemployment that characterized the last 4 years than the 6 and 7% where we would have been if this had been a normal post-recession recovery. So the price of uncertainty has had an impact on the average American. As one columnist put it in the Wall Street Journal not too long ago, he said, if America had experienced the level of uncertainty that existed in 2006, we would have had 2 million more jobs available in this country today. So it matters on the actions that Congress takes. It matters which direction that Congress is willing to go on those fundamental issues, because without action on the part of Congress, it's very difficult for the private sector to make the decisions, to take the risk, whether to hire more people or to invest in capital equipment. And we've also entered uncharted waters with respect to the debt. Today, our debt is now the equivalent of 73% of the gross domestic product. Compare that to 36% of the gross domestic product at the end of 2007. And the trajectory for our debt, without any changes in law, will go as high as 77% towards the end of the decade. And will begin that rise starting in 2016 or 2017, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Because there are going to be 77 million Americans who will be retiring over the next 20 years. Colonel Hauenstein is not retiring, though. But what does that portend for the for the entitlement programs such as Social Security and Medicare, given the size of that demographic and what will occur? I mean, that is 10,000 retirees on a daily basis over the next 20 years. So obviously we ignored this issue at our peril. And in fact, the Congressional Budget Office indicated that we are bearing risks and incurring costs that we haven't seen since World War II. And in World War II, after post-World War II, we had a significant level of debt, but it was debt that we owed to ourselves. So it's no wonder then that the economy continues to be a primary concern to American people in all of the polls in recent times. And in fact, Gallup last month conducted a survey that showed that dysfunction was on the top of the list. It was 33%, and they said that was the highest level of concern by Americans since 1939. In fact, it was a 74-year high. And they said that this has been the lowest level of confidence the American people have had in the way in which our country is being governed since they started asking the question in 1979. And frankly, that's what contributed as well to why I left the Senate, because I wanted to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And so I did decide to take the fight, as I said earlier, in a different direction, and to take my knowledge and my experience and to give voice to the frustration to more than 90% of the American people who feel that Congress is far too partisan, and obviously they're right. I decided to write a book. It wasn't on my agenda initially, but I had been approached to write about my experiences, how Congress worked, and specifically the Senate. And frankly, I shouldn't say this in front of Hank, but I've been told that it's fun to have written a book. It's not fun to write a book, and I can attest to that. But I persevered because I thought it was so important to discuss how we have arrived at this point where partisanship has undermined our political process and what we can do about it. In fact, in my book, I have one chapter entitled 2011, 2012, two very bad years. I guess I could have added another chapter that would say 2013, even a worse year. But I am passionate about changing the tenor of government because I know that we can do it. It hasn't always been this way, and it doesn't have to be this way. Everywhere I've traveled in the country, people ask me, why is it so challenging to achieve bipartisan solutions in today's environment? And it's a very good question. And there are a number of issues that obviously have contributed to the polarizing dynamic that we are experiencing. But it is true that the red states are getting redder and the blue states are getting bluer. And there are a number of statistics that buttress that point. For example, in 1987, there were 57 senators who represented one party, but their states voted for the presidential candidate of the opposing party. Today, there are only 21 senators in that category. So for 79% of the Senate, there really isn't an incentive to take the risk of crossing the political aisle because they will incur a primary challenge. Everything is focused on the primary rather than the concerns about the broader electorate in the general election. Nate Silver, who is a statistician, did analysis of the House of Representatives. And in 1992, he determined there were 103 seats that would be viewed to be competitive out of 435 in the House of Representatives. Today, he contended that there are 35 seats that are actually viewed as toss-ups in the House of Representatives. Another study, the Fair Vote study, that was released earlier this year, said there were only 21 seats that you would be viewed as competitive or toss-ups. So in other words, that these elections are almost foregone conclusions before they even occur. Now, the National Journal, which is a highly respected publication on Capitol Hill, has done an analysis of voting trends in both the House and the Senate since 1982. And in the first analysis in 1982, they concluded that there were 58 senators in the United States Senate that came between the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican, that 58 senators occupied the middle ground. Today, for the third year in a row and for the fourth time ever, the number of senators that fall into that category is literally zero. That means that there's no senator that is more, no Democratic senator is more conservative than a Republican, and that there's no Republican that's more liberal than a Democrat. In the House of Representatives, in 1982, there were 344 members who were willing to cross the political aisle and vote on a bipartisan basis. And today, they established that there are only 13 out of 435. So hence, the kind of solidification and homogenization, of the voting trends in the House of Representatives and even in the United States Senate, because you don't have the opportunity now to work across the political aisle, because even with the legislative process, you're impeded from having the ability to offer amendments and to work in a way that you can bridge those differences. It's no longer designed to bridge the differences. It's designed to advance the political party agenda so they can take it to the next election or to frame the 30-second soundbite. So it's no wonder then that Congress has reached an historical low level of inactivity. The last Congress, I think, had been the least productive since 1947. And in that Congress, President Truman had described it as a do-nothing Congress. Well, the 80th Congress then passed 906 bills that became law, compared to the 283 bills that passed in the last Congress that became law. This year, a commentator was stated the other day that this could be, the least productive Congress in modern history. To this point, they've only passed 56 bills in the United States Congress. So I think it illustrates the point of how little has been accomplished, let alone on the key issues that matter to the country profoundly. So it's no wonder then that 3 political scientists conducted a study and said that we are at the highest level of polarization in the United States Congress since the end of Reconstruction in 1879. So what does that tell you? That we are more polarized than at any other point in 134 years. Oftentimes, when this study came out, I would hear, well, it used to be worse in the United States Senate. There used to be duels and brawls and canings. They cite the early 1800s, and I thought, well, what does that tell you? That we are using that as a standard for the Senate in the second decade of the 21st century. We're surrounded by all this history, but we're not inspired by it, regrettably. We have lost the art of legislating. There's no question. That was the other reality that I confronted. It wasn't the way it used to be in terms of being able to work through the process. Oftentimes I threatened to go to the floor and conduct a refresher course on how a bill becomes law, like in Schoolhouse Rocks. Let's start at the beginning. Let's just start at the beginning and go through this. If you think about it, more than half of the Senate, more than half of the House of Representatives have served in their respective chambers for less than 6 years. So you don't have those who are familiar in terms of how it used to work. And for many of the newer members then, the only legislative environment that they are familiar with is obviously the current one. And that's why it's important and critical to change this legislative dynamic and this polarization now, so that it doesn't become embedded in the culture and the institutional norms and practices of the United States Congress. At the end of last year, the majority leader and minority leader decided to try to inspire some collaboration in the Senate. So they invited the senators and their spouses and some of the key staff to see the movie Lincoln in the National Visitor Center in the auditorium, which was a phenomenal movie. But I thought to myself, well, what does that say that we have to look to Hollywood for a dose of reality, In any event, it's what it was. And it didn't inspire it because we had the fiscal cliff agreement vote on New Year's Day at 2 o'clock in the morning. So it really does bring us to the question of what do we do about it? Because I believe, in the can-do approach. America is a can-do country. And frankly, I came to the conclusion that, we have certainly a representative democracy. We get the government we demand. And if we value bipartisanship, if we value consensus, then we will get it. And that there should be a political reward for those who are willing, to bridge the divide, to be the consensus builders and the problem solvers, and a political penalty for those who don't. I created Olympia's List, which is a political action committee, because I am going to support, consensus candidates in the primaries, because I think it's so important that we support those individuals who are willing to maximize the potential of public office and to do what's right. I know that's, what was expected of me in representing the state of Maine. They expected me to do the right thing in the right way for the right reasons, for the country, for the state, and the party in that order. And I've also joined the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is based in Washington. It was co-founded by four former Senate majority leaders, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, where I'm a senior fellow. And I'm co-chairing the Commission on Political Reform. And we have had a series of town meetings to examine the causes and consequences of this polarizing divide and what we can do about it. And we will be developing political, electoral, and legislative reforms and recommendations so that we can move forward in terms of trying to launch these initiatives as well, not only recommending, but how we can implement them, because it is critically important that we make the changes that are essential, whether it's independent redistricting commissions, open primaries, requiring Congress to work 5 days a week, which is vastly important. Congress isn't there working, nothing gets done. And that's essentially what's also happened and is reflective of the paltry schedule that has been in place. There are many incentives to divide. The polarizing forces are well organized and they are well funded. We need a counterweight to the forces of extremism and the far-reaching views that's imperiling the future of our country. And that's why we have to weigh in. Your voice and your vote matter. And you need to communicate that with your elected officials, both in real time now, and yes, in the elections, and demanding what are they doing to affect, solutions and to make the process work. Because that communication cannot be underestimated. And so many people do not believe that it makes a difference, but it really does. And to my point, after the shutdown, Politico, Capitol Hill newspaper, wrote a story. And they said there were about 8 or 10 pre-shutdown assumptions that didn't pan out. And one of them was the fact that the lawmakers were surprised that there was no public outcry or backlash to the shutdown. It was reflected in the polls, but they didn't hear from their constituents. They only heard from, obviously, their political corridor. And so it does make a difference. You know, people ask me about, well, you know, on the FAA, for example, you know, last spring when we had the automatic cuts trigger, and there was a cutback in airline traffic controllers. And we saw a number of slowdowns at various airports. Well, Congress worked immediately to restore the cuts for the traffic controls because they did not want to be sitting and idling planes on the tarmac with their constituents, with the pilot coming over the intercom saying this is due to congressional budget cuts. So yes, it does matter. It obviously matters. And hence you had the agreement yesterday, because they understand fundamentally when you have a 5 to 7 to 8% approval rating, which is a historic low, public confidence in Congress is at an all-time low. I mean, root canals are more popular, according to various analysis. But, you know, you realize we have a serious problem. And we have a crisis of confidence, and rightfully so. And that's what has to change. And so that we can affect that change. And I feel very strongly that public participation and activism is going to make the difference. You have to weigh in. And that's why this Common Ground initiative becomes instrumental and crucial to the kind of engagement that we need at the local level to percolate up and to make sure that people in Washington understand that this is unacceptable and it's unconscionable. Someone once said that bipartisanship is not, you know, a political theory. It is a political necessity. The late Senator Warren Rudman of New Hampshire once said that politics is too important to be left to the politician, and he couldn't have been more right. That's so true. But silence is not golden in this instance. We have to be able to convey our views strenuously and forcefully. And frankly, it's right at our fingertips. You can use social media, online technology, just as those who have fanned the flames of polarization. And you can use the same means to create an online community instantaneously, effectively. It's a message multiplier. We're not in the rotary dial phones anymore. It's not making those calls one by one. We can build a network of support and making a difference in Washington. There are plenty of incentives, as I said, to divide. We have to have incentives to unite in this country. And that's why I wrote the book that I did, to engage the public. It's sort of a blueprint in some ways in the ideas and recommendations that I think can make a profound difference. And regardless of what the polarizing forces of the political classes will have you believe, you can bridge the divide and you can defeat the machinery of partisanship. So we can together make Congress the solution-driven powerhouse that it once was, so that we can reignite the inspiration and the flame that was set by people like the Senator Vandenbergs of President Gerald Ford. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Yes, go ahead. Wait over there, sir. Yes. I'll go one each side.
You know, it really is an honor to have you here at Grand Rapids and to see you in person. I have been watching you and your friend from Maine for many, many years on C-SPAN. Speaking of common ground, you and I were born in the same year.
Well, wow, did you?
It's coming up in January. And I want to wish you an early happy birthday.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
I have been thinking long and hard about a question that I wanted to ask you in all due respect, because as a person, when I watch you people in the Senate, I understand about the power that you have and what history calls the so-called Millionaires Club. And I'm glad you feel our pain about the way we feel about our country today and how people are divided. Citizens United contribute to that. Most of us understand that most of the districts are gerrymandered. Most of us understand that most people probably go into politics as public servants, and then they get manipulated by the big money that it takes to be reelected. And then the question is, if somebody's going to dump a bunch of bucks on your campaign, who do you listen to first? I've never heard a politician say what you just said a little while ago about country, state, and, of course, the people where you came from as far as who you owe and what you're there to do, to serve. I admire you so much, and also the lady that was there before, Margaret Chase Smith. My question to you is this, and it's a sincere question. Is our country turning into a bunch of politicians that are basically being puppeted by big dollars? I mean, you mentioned primary over and over and over again. And it's the people that are cherry-picked by big money people, all right, that come out of no place, that spend a lot of bucks in a primary and knock out good public officials. Just like the former Senator Lugar, you know, from Ohio. Guy was a great compromiser. Is this country being basically changed into an oligarchy?
Well, it gets to the heart of the concern that you're raising about the level of money that's invested in these campaigns, which is deeply troubling and disturbing. In the Citizens United decision, it was my provision that was struck down by the court. It had been challenged on a previous occasion, but that's when Sandra Day O'Connor was still on the bench. And unfortunately, it was struck down this time, and then they rolled back 100 years of case law and precedent that unleashed the force of super PACs, and which meant multiple millions more in these campaigns. You know, as a candidate, I always, I feared, who's going to come in and, run ads against you because you didn't know the extent of the amount. And that's what's happened that has transformed these campaigns dramatically. In fact, I think that back in 1990, they spent, I don't know if it was very little money. It was something like 15 million outside ads, and today, frankly, in the last election, it was over, $500 million in outside ads. It's not just with the candidates; these are the independent expenditures that are used in these campaigns, and 71% of those ads are attack ads. So it further divides the country. See, there is a financial benefit to continuing to perpetuate the divisions in this country, frankly, because you get a whole, you have groups of, political, people, consultants, and everything else. They're going to fuel that divide. So they don't want to solve problems in Washington because then they can go back to whoever, they represent or to their constituencies and say, see, they're not doing this. Did you see that vote? And just keep, accentuating the differences. And those millions of dollars are detrimental to the interests of this country, no question, because it all has now gone back to the primary system because they've driven this wedge that's grown wider and wider. The American people are still in the middle. The majority of Americans are in the middle. They want their government to work. What?
We used to be in the middle.
Yeah, and I believe we still are, and some of the polls will document that most Americans want their government to work, that there are enough shared beliefs and views. And that struck me, frankly, in traveling the country. is that even if some people were on the right, or the far right or the left, wanted their government to work. But it's those who are driving the ideological wedge, to having you believe that wedge and that chasm is so great that you can never bridge it, and that is not true. American people want their government to work in the final analysis, and the government's not working. And so rather than having, more centrist candidates emerging from the primary, like center right and center left, you're having far right and far left. And then you compound the problem with the gerrymandering of the congressional districts, and, in many instances with primaries not getting, allowing independents and, to vote in primaries. So it's hard to mitigate those forces. In fact, I don't know if you saw a CNN report not too long ago that, showed some of the districts that were gerrymandered and how they were configured. One was called the Earmuff District, one road that connected two sides, and then there were several others that were, looked like prehistoric animals. So it just is an indication to the, to the nth degree, that they would draw these lines in a way that were solidly red or solidly blue. California developed an independent redistricting commission and has worked well for them because, as Governor Brown said, I was told recently in a speech, talking about how it forced the candidates to be more oriented towards the middle and to appeal to the middle because they had to be concerned about getting the support from more centrist voters than just from the far left or far right, depending on which party that they represented. So it does make a difference, and that's what has to change in campaign finance reform. But I'll tell you, I worked on that for many years in conjunction with Senator McCain and Senator Feingold, and as I said, my provision was part of that. Is now a question how you withstand a constitutional challenge, because that's the real pivot point, as whether or not you'd face that once again. So we will be looking at the bipartisan policies, and there's an interest in looking at the whole question. The question is, what is it that you can do that can, go to the heart of the issue? Okay, I'll go in the middle, and I'll go this way. Thank you.
Listening to Speaker Boehner today, it sounds like the frustration level has finally hit the House leadership. Do you think he'll be able to keep his job as Speaker?
Well, I admire him for, what he said today, because he understands that, in the final analysis, you have to govern the country. There's a responsibility to fulfill in the interests, of the country moving forward. And so, he understands the practicality of governing. You can't just lock down and say it's my way or the highway. I mean, there's this whole preposterous notion that somehow you're going to get 100% of what you want. I'd like to know which sphere of life you can get that. Let me know, because you can't solve these problems without talking with people with whom you disagree, and that you don't have a monopoly on all the great ideas, and, that you have to respect the differing views. And so obviously I think he's recognized that, and he realizes it imperils the country. I mean, this kind of dysfunction does put the future in jeopardy, frankly, because the issues that have been long deferred and neglected are only compounding the problem in future years. And that future is not a long-distance one. It's upon us because of those demographics that I referred to earlier. And so we have a narrow window in which to, address those questions without imposing severe measures in order to reform those programs and bring down the debt. So I think he understood, that the absurdity of their positions of saying, as he said, they hadn't even read the bill and they were already opposed to it.
Will he pay a price for it, though?
Well, I would bet not. I would hope not. I mean, I know Speaker Boehner because I served with him in the House of Representatives, and he is, he's practical. I mean, he's not ideological in that sense, but he's got a very challenging conference. I mean, let me put it this way. It was far different than when I was in the House of Representatives, I can assure you. We used to work across the political aisle and centrists within the Republican Party. We had our own group and worked on issues. In fact, I worked with Paul Henry, his wife Karen. Karen, yes, it was great, and Carl Purcell was another. We worked mightily on different issues within the Republican Party and across the aisle because there was a tolerance for differing views and accommodation. But that no longer exists today. So it's a purified world. Well, that just doesn't exist, and it's not reflective of who we are as a country. And I think that it's time, to squash that approach. Yes.
With considering the increased use of the filibuster over the last couple
Yes.
of years, I wonder, what your impressions are of the so-called nuclear option that was recently implemented. Is that a necessity? Is it what was that, an inevitability? Is it a tragedy? And where do you, or something else, or where do you see that going from here on out? Thank you.
That's an important question as well, because the very fact that the majority leader changed the rules of the Senate by a majority vote is disturbing. It fundamentally changes the practices and traditions of the Senate. It ordinarily requires 2/3. And so he used a majority vote to change the rules of the Senate and to allow a majority vote on all appointees with the exception of the Supreme Court. And I think that it could change the institution, because the fact is there's a long memory in the United States Senate. One doesn't forget what the other did in their respective positions. So each employs the other's tactics. So if the majority becomes the minority becomes the majority. They say, well, you know what? When they were in the minority, this is what they did. And that's exactly what happened with the nuclear option. In 2005, the Republican majority leader recommended a nuclear option, and I and 13 others in the United States Senate formed the Gang of 14. They're always called gangs. I don't know why, but maybe that suits us, so they did at the time. But 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans. And we reached an agreement, an accord based on mutual trust. And that was that we would decide in which circumstances that we deemed it to be extraordinary circumstances that we would vote for a filibuster of a particular judicial nominee. So we had to trust one another to make that decision and interpretation of what constituted extraordinary circumstances. So we allowed the process to go forward, and it worked. And we avoided crossing the political Rubicon, because the institution of the Senate is predicated on majority rule, but it's also based on accommodating the rights of the minority. That's what distinguishes the institution of the United States Senate from the U.S. House of Representatives. It's the checks and balances and the weight that the Founding Fathers gave to each institution. So the institution of the House is a majority rule institution. The United States Senate is not. Does that mean to say that there haven't been abuses of filibuster? Absolutely, on both sides, and certainly on the, in recent times with the Republicans. And using and invoking, if the filibuster, but it was on both sides, and it just got ratcheted up and ratcheted up. And so what happened is that the majority leader, in this instance over the last few years, decided to fill the amendment tree without getting into the legislative weeds. But that was key. Filling the amendment tree meant that the majority leader would decide which amendments will be offered in the United States Senate to any initiative that was reported to the floor, even those amendments that would be offered by the minority. He would take the minority amendments and redesign them. And he would fill a tree so it foreclosed the opportunity for the minority to offer amendments. That happened up until through the last Congress 67 times by the majority leaders since 2007. Compare that to the 40 times that procedure occurred for 6 former majority leaders reaching back to 1985. So in other words, in that 6-year period, essentially, or 5 years, he executed that 67 times, shutting down the amendment process, compared to 40 times by 6 former majority leaders over, 10, 15, almost 26 years. I mean, fundamental difference. And when you shut down the legislative process in that fashion in the Senate, which goes contrary, to the practices and norms of the Senate to build that consensus, you basically foreclose the voices of the that population that those senators represent. If you're talking about 46, 47 at the time, representing millions of Americans, you shut down the ability to represent those voices on the floor and where it can matter and where you can bridge the differences, rather than being a parliamentary system, which was the case basically over the last few years. Each side would offer their respective positions, and when they didn't prevail, instead of trying to work it out through amendments, they took it to the next election. But that didn't do anything to advance the interests and the solutions to the problems the country was confronting. And that was the point. So it became more like a parliamentary system rather than the nature of the institution as it was originally designed. So I'm bothered by what happened there and the way in which it's executed. Does that mean to say, for example, if the Republicans become the majority, will there not be pressure on them to say, well, you know what? Let's execute the nuclear option for the legislative process. So, in essence, you fundamentally changed the architecture of the Senate.
What's worse, that or complete, ceasing of any sort of legislative process, which is what it seems like it's come to?
Well, that's where, I think that it matters about the public's voice and mattering and not allowing it and demanding accountability. I think in elections, for example, and not always waiting to elections, that's the point I'm making, real time, you can communicate with your lawmakers, demand that they cancel recesses, stay in session, work 5 days a week, get to know each other, get to know the issues, work it out. There are a lot of people who want to work it out. But if you lock down the process, which is in the hands of leadership, then you can't get anything done. And so I think the point is it does matter to weigh in that fashion and demand accountability in the elections, ask them how they're going to make the system work. And that's true of presidential campaigns. When it comes time, when that moment, during the course of a presidential campaign is demanding, from presidential candidates, what are you going to do to make sure that the executive branch is working with the legislative branch? You have to have that interaction and that interrelationship between two branches of government. They cannot operate in a parallel universes. It simply will not work. And it is important to have bipartisan leadership meetings, with the president. There has to be that engagement. And unfortunately, it just doesn't exist in the way in which it did in the past, where they would have regular meetings. And perhaps that's something we need to demand. It's no longer inside the Beltway problem. It's now a problem for the country when it shuts down and when there's a lack of communication between the president and the Congress.
One more question.
Now you're making me pick. Yes, sir.
Would you like to comment or make any suggestions about the Republican Party appealing to the women in our country? I don't think they're appealing to the women.
You are absolutely correct. I know that. That's right. They're not. It's interesting because in so many ways I think we've regressed as a party. In terms of our own history, frankly, if you think back on our legacy as far as women are concerned, but also just in even recent times. I remember having a meeting, arranging a meeting on behalf of Republican women in the House and one woman in the Senate, at that time Nancy Castlebaum, with President Reagan to talk about how we could address the gender gap that existed at the time. And we had a slew of legislative issues, and he went about, the President Reagan went about, implementing them, got them through Congress, and we worked together because we recognized that from a policy substantive point that these issues needed to be addressed, such as pension reform and child support enforcement, IRAs for homemakers, and the list went on. But we recognized the reality to appeal to women. And unfortunately, the message and the perception and the statements, the regrettable statements and fortunate statements made by candidates and some of the elected officials, has set the party back, and they have to really recast, not only in words, but in actions and in policies, because it matters. It matters profoundly, I think, to the Republican Party. And I just think providing remedial classes on how to become more sensitive is not progress, in my estimation.
I want to give you a little something to stay here.
You want me to answer any more questions?
Senator Snowe, I want to thank you for a very enlightening, amazing presentation, really, that is so focused us on the problem, and I think gives us a sense of hope of the things that we can do. I look out at this audience, and I look at the leadership in this room and the ways we can be inspired from what we've heard this evening. I'm thinking of the university leadership, for example. I'm looking at our provost, Gail Davis. We've had a lot of conversations about common ground. I look forward to continuing those conversations with you, Gail. I look at the civic leadership in this room. I look at Mayor Logie, for example. I'd like to continue this conversation with you, sir, because I think we hit some such important points and the whole meaning of public service and what that entails today and the commitments that involves and the idealism that we cannot let get eroded anymore. And then I look at the private sector leadership in this room as well. Of course, Ralph was such a pace setter there, Hank Meijer. I continue to look forward to our conversations as well as we move forward on common ground. Senator Snowe, as a very modest token of our appreciation for your presentation and being here in this wintry Grand Rapids, you get to take home with you a Ralph Hauenstein swag bag.
All right. Thank you. Swag bag. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.